good teaching materials, especially from people who were leaders in the field, were hard to come by. So I thought, gee, wouldn't it be interesting to have perspectives on comparative and international education from the luminaries in the field in the form of interviews and questions.
The video we produced 10 years ago, it had this mono-author feel to it, where you were getting this rich history from individuals without, much intersection with the entities they were speaking about. Right. So, I mean, if in this version you had people speaking about the rise of project-based evidence and field-based work, and then you had interviews with USAID or with NGOs in the field to go with that, I think that would make a lot of sense.
I remember also a meeting of the Society which was held in conjunction with one of the teacher organizations. A few of us sitting round a table wondering whether we would ever make it. Well, we met in Atlanta, I believe, the first time, and it was successful, and well, I guess at that meeting maybe 35 or 40 people showed up, and we thought that that was a tremendous success. And now, of course, when you go to the CIES meeting, what do you have? 1,000, 1,500, something extraordinary.
During my presidency, perhaps the most important things that occurred in the society had to do with a consolidation of what I would term the scale of the society. Mine was the final stage in creating the position of executive director and having the society managed by a professional association management company.
Other areas in the field of education are affected by the Comparative Education Society, and with our growth, we've had people from other areas become interested in comparative and international education, that all areas are affected in the field of education, in teacher education. It's no longer an area that started in so-called foundations, but it's spread to other areas, so we've become more diverse.
The membership is what defines the field, what work the members do. And what the work of the members do reflect who they are. And when you look at how the membership has evolved, you also have a sense of how complex the issues they are tackling, they are interested in, they're involved in, have also evolved. Being elected as in the leadership of the society is really a metaphor for where CIES has gone. And so how do we utilize that complexity in the most creative and most productive way?
We need to have plurality of traditions and different cultures coming into the field, and both you and I are aware of different comparative educations. This is a phrase used by Robert Cowan in particular, which arise from different cultures and different groups, quantitative, qualitative, different foci within the field.
What really became important for us there, I think, is how we can get Southern voices into the comparative international education discussion in a more meaningful and more fundamental way. So a lot of our work is about bringing other players and actors into the space that wouldn't necessarily have been there before. So a lot of our work is around travel grants, but also featuring the work that happens in these different parts of the world. And we're hoping that that discussion will provide the kind of edge that we need to sharpen both thinking and practice.
I think it was a good decision, a couple of things. One was to expand thematically the establishment of CIES and being liberal about CIES that come in, to encourage community building, people interested in sustainable development in your field, or assessment, or in globalization, but also area studies like Japan. CIES was one of the first. That was Victor's baby. That helped to attract people that otherwise would not have come. The second expansion was by really systematically invite foundations and agencies. The World Bank, even though they were always criticized at CIES, they were good guys in CIES. They came, they participated in debate. Same with Soros Foundation. They would come, USAID would come, Inter-American Development Bank would come. It is really dangerous, especially to do development work without being part of a debate and part of a professional community that has professional standards. We have a critical view on development. You don't want people to do surgeries on people. Why do we want people to export education or do development work? We want them to be part of this community and participate. And that's what I mean with trying to professionalize. So we also expanded it by, for instance, during my presidency, it was very important for me to have panels with agencies.
From a policy perspective, the big challenges I see are for the field of international and comparative education to be able to translate to policymakers effectively all that we know about education, about teaching and learning, about the broad range of subjects. A really big challenge certainly is around the post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals. Our field of international comparative education has a tendency, and it's important and crucial, to look at nuance, look at context. That level of nuance is very hard to retain when you translate things up to the level of a global sustainable development goal.
When I was president, one of my main goals was to try to give more power to the Comparative International Education Society. I wanted to be able to communicate to different audiences all the great work that we do, the research that we do, to have more prominence, to have more influence in policy.
The research that is generated by the members of the academic community represented here at CIES has a direct influence on the policy decisions and policy information sphere that we have to rely on when we design programs, when we monitor programs, and when we measure programs. It would have been much easier for me, much harder for me to get people to understand it and to use that information. So having the credibility of such thinkers at CIES, having there's the massive affirmation of such concepts has been key to helping us move in the right directions. So the academic community through CIES has really been able to zoom in on issues of exclusion and marginalization, and that has made a very important difference in the way we program our and invest in our programs at USAID.
This society brings together scholars and policymakers and practitioners. It is also that it attracts the kind of people who want to move between these different worlds, who relish the interactions across them. And for this, we're willing to brave diverging lexicons, different norms, and very different incentives.
Education is by definition a multidisciplinary, and in that sense there's no one approach that really does justice to the complexities of education reform and educational needs. This is truly a field where mixed methods are necessary and where being able to draw from the wide variety of methodological approaches that are available is a must.
That the countries and governments and educators in the countries we work with, they themselves also have raised awareness of the importance of the monitoring and evaluation and the evidence-based decision-making.
How do we measure learning? This is PISA 2004. What does it show? It shows countries aligned. Then there are those who look at not the top, but the BOP. That is the bottom of the pyramid. And yesterday we had a bit of conversation at this EGRA panel about why it is that there's so many people at the bottom of the pyramid. Why is it that the EGRA test shows so many zeros? And what do you do about it when you're focused at the BOP as opposed to the TOP? This is an interesting scientific question.
There are many things about PISA, good, bad, and indifferent, but This chart shows the curves for mathematics for Shanghai, Hong Kong, Singapore, Vietnam, Finland, UK, Malaysia, Indonesia. They really are very different, but they do tell you in Shanghai, which is this blue line, it is not a bell curve. This test is too easy for people in Shanghai. From a psychometric point of view, it's not really discriminating very well. And it's too difficult for people in Indonesia because the curve leans right to the left.
Another problem that has emerged is that it's easier to take more students into schools even when they're crowded, and even when you don't have facilities, even when they don't have a place to sit, and to brag about participation rates than it is to set out the conditions where children learn. We know that there are more children being educated today around the world, but it's not clear that there are more children learning substantial amounts. And that's evidenced by some of the international testing.
I think that there's an increasing interest and focus on the so-called gold standard, randomized controlled trials, and that we, to a certain extent, are going out to the so-called developed world, dividing populations into experiment group and control groups, and applying a very sort of mechanistic research paradigm that is referred to as a gold standard way of approach. And I find it very scary that we do that. And I think it has to do with this idea that started with the beginning of the comparative education review, that comparative and international education is the field of the academic practitioner. And I think this is a worrisome view that sort of we are the best of the best because we both have the academic skills and also the practitioner skills. So we know the field and we know the methodologies and the literature reviews. So we can go out there, look at other populations and assess them.
Well, I think there are many external events that have shaped the comparative and international education field. But I just want to mention a major one, and that's the sea change starting in the 1980s into a neoliberal era. And neoliberalism brought to education many quite problematic changes. The view of higher education as a private good, the privatization of education at all levels, the attack on teachers, the narrowing of educational outcomes, the neglect of educational resources, the fetishism with testing. For the last 30 and more years, the comparative and international education field has been embroiled in discussions of neoliberal issues.
I think if I look back 5 years ago, the issue of low-fee private schools, particularly in Africa and India, was something that we were really concerned about, and it was something that we were featuring in our work at country level. And at CIES, our first discussion on that, I think we were talking to ourselves, more or less. We only had a group of people around us. It was one of the workshops on a Sunday. Now, 5 years later, it's we have panels on it. There are a range of other people talking about the same thing. I think in a sense we're riding part of a wave. This is an issue that has become far more significant in education generally. But within that, we're keen to, I think, show up the human rights issues that come up with privatization.
Today's session is on consulting firms and education business and their role in selling reform. So we have 4 speakers today, starting with Ida. And she's going to be looking at some of the systems features. And then Shalaha Fanel is going next, speaking on private interest in Pakistan, education policy. Sam Seller and Anna Hogan are going to be speaking on a project they're doing with Bob Lingard on Pearson. And then Daniel Friedrich on Teach for All in Chile and Argentina. Then the discussant today is Alexandra Draxler.
Sitting on
started to flee their country in 2011 when the popular uprising for regime change against the current President Bashar al-Assad was met with considerable violence. And actually today is the anniversary of this, the start of this uprising in Daraa province, and it is now 4 years since the crisis in Syria started. According to UNHCR, there is almost 4 million registered Syrian refugees in Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon, and Turkey.
And given that education is a powerful tool for combating inequity and discrimination in today's conflict-ridden world, I felt that I would take the quote from the old Sanskrit saying, education is that which liberates. And what it means is that it liberates the mind. A true education should liberate the mind from ignorance and prejudice.
New scholars enter the field knowing that academia has changed and that the university system has changed, but that it still offers a platform to do the kind of research that can really make a difference.
But the other question I have is about your saying that you only want to study the English-speaking universities in North America. I think the essence of comparative education is to try and find something to compare.
Do we really do serious theory testing? Do we really look at different kinds of theories about education and society, education and national and social development? Do we look at different models and try to test that with data, empirical observations of all kinds? Or do we digress into sort of petty criticism of each other's perspectives?
In fact, I'm doing some writing now. The development of the idea of comparative education and international education and the conflation of those two fields. There are only 2 centers that I know of that have the title of comparative education and comparative education alone. Those two centers are the one that I directed at Loyola University of Chicago, which is the Center for Comparative Education, and the one in Hong Kong, the Comparative Education Research Center. If you look at all of the other centers, I think around the world, but certainly North America, you will not find a single center, a single program that has only the name comparative education in it. I think that's created a lot of confusion in the minds of people, which makes the archives that much more important, because at least you have something to look at to figure out what is this animal called comparative education.
I think that we, as members of CIES, have both a challenge and an opportunity to explain what it is that's unique and significant about what we do and how we do comparative and international education, and how that might differ from, let's say, an extremely competent mathematics researcher who has been working in Belgium and then does some work in Senegal. Because of what I think we have to offer is some guidance on how you can learn to do comparative international work, and what are the sort of the cultural and research methods pieces that you need.
I think that CIES has done actually a great work in keeping up with changes in the field and with the challenges, global challenges that we have in education. So I think there has been very good work done. I think areas where we need to pay more attention is how people learn, trying to better understand how people learn, all kinds of people, not only children, but also scholars, teachers, and try to put those ideas into practice.
It seems to me that we've covered everything very, very well, except perhaps economics. And the reason for that is that we rejected economics, its epistemology and its ontology as a field. And I think that may have been a loss for our society overall, in that the economists became the leading thinkers in the practice of comparative education in international organizations. And our society stood outside of that and criticized them, but actually had very little engagement methodologically in shaping the economics of education. I think that's probably a gap in our society.
Well, I'm glad to see you here. I would like to introduce 4 generations of China Comparative Education Society. We all came from Institute of International and Comparative Education, Beijing Normal University. Professor Gu Mingyuan, the first generation, Professor Wang Yingjie, the second one, Professor Liu Baochen, the third one, and Teng Jun, the fourth one. 北京欢迎你，北师大欢迎你。
I was at Teachers College for 40 years, Alice, and from 1935 to 1975. From 35 to 55, I was mainly teaching the history of education. It was just the time when Teachers College was beginning to get both feet into the international education field, called technical assistance at the time, too.
Jackie really transformed the field of education and emergencies. When the field was born, I would say it was characterized by the need to get education on the humanitarian agenda. Jackie changed that narrative from being one about getting education into the humanitarian space to being about a focus on teachers and what they're doing in their classrooms, and a focus on children and what they're learning, and a specific focus on girls and why they face unique barriers to education.
I had the habit of writing a few pages every day. So I don't know how many thousand pages I wrote.
We went to Peru without knowing much about Peru. We had to go to the library and read some books. But we were being sent as instant experts to reform the Peruvian educational system. The assumption was that we would use the model of the American educational system. You take the ideal, not just the model of the American, but the ideal of the American educational system, and then you subtract the Peruvian practice, and the difference is the aid project. And we could play that game too.
I was about halfway through my presidency when the violence around the World Trade Center bombing and its aftermath took place. At that time, I was still teaching at Colgate University, which experienced a number of tragedies for such a small school located in New York. We would think that that would be a likely scenario, and in fact it was. I remember during the day of the bombing and a couple of weeks thereafter, all of the reactions of my students. Some were really awesome in their open-heartedness. Others were much more narrow in their thinking about world events. It got me thinking a great deal about what university should be like as a space.
In the field, we're very Europe-focused. Europe, North America, what we now think of as OECD countries, with a few small bows to quote developing countries. But at the same time, what influenced that particular point in time was the fact that the whole generation of young scholars trained under Ford Foundation money, National Defense Education Act scholarships in the 60s and so forth, who were all third world specialists. And all of whom had done field work and or Peace Corps or WUSC or some kind of activity like that in the developing world, were the new young Turks of the field.
I think 20 years of too much attention paid to ideology and political correctness may have distorted the field, particularly the conflict theories.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, now don't hold your positions. We're going to join you here. Can we get
okay.
future presidents and Trump? What's past is prologue. Do we need to like kneel in front, or what do you think? To our elders.
Fantastico. Fantastico. Yeah. Did you get that? Fantastico.
Perception. No, not perception, but policies. She has very interesting table saying this policy failed. 5 policies failed. In a stance.
60th anniversary of the CIES, and I think they're doing a documentary kind of on all of the different presidents. I was not a president, excuse me, I just feel I have to see.
Yeah, you haven't been a president yet.
And you're going to put it together, a short thing? Oh, that's great. That's
So
great.
this is now in the CIS setting.
Great, great.
Were you the
Yeah, I want to go
6:30, but I need you.
Let's bring a dress. I can put some. Yeah, I'm gonna come back and change too.
Okay.
So, well, I could put.
So this is the future of CIS.